Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a really fascinating bit of secret history, the world of military coups and, well, the CIA.
Right. And we often hear these, almost notorious stories about CIA involvement during the Cold War. Places like Guatemala, Iran, Chile. They come up a lot.
They really do. But what if we told you there was this crucial NATO ally sharing a massive border with the Soviet Union, where the story might actually be, well, quite different?
You're talking about Turkey. Its strategic position was just immense during the Cold War. So naturally, questions about whether the U.S. had a hand in its domestic upheavals, its coups, it's always been a huge topic. They're part of the national conversation, really.
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're digging into a specific paper by Burak Kürkçü. He's meticulously gone through declassified CIA archives.
Yeah, trying to answer that big question, was the U.S. directly involved in the military coups in Turkey during the Cold War?
Because the popular narratives, they often clash, don't they? Some absolutely insist the U.S. was pulling the strings. Others completely deny it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're here to look at what those declassified documents actually say, to try and cut through the noise, get to the facts as they appear in the archives.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Before we zoom in on Turkey, it's probably helpful to understand how experts, and maybe even the CIA itself, actually think about coups. It's not just random chaos, is it? Sounds like there's a real strategy involved sometimes.
Oh, definitely not random. There are several sort of academic ways to look at military takeovers. You've got Edward Luttwak's battle approach, which sees coups basically as power struggles, factions within the military fighting it out.
Like a chess game, almost.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's Eric Nordlinger's idea, the elections perspective. He saw coups as, believe it or not, violent versions of elections. Success depends on getting enough political support within the system.
Wow, okay.
And then Nanahal Singh built on that with his coordination model. His idea is that plotters win by convincing the rest of the army that they've already won. It's about communication, creating inevitability.
Fascinating stuff. So it's not just brute force, it's strategy, communication, managing perceptions.
Precisely. And the CIA, they were thinking along these lines too. They actually developed their own quantitative methods to try and predict coups in unstable countries.
They had a system, like a checklist.
Pretty much. You can see it in their reports from the mid-'80s. They tracked specific things, political indicators, for instance, armed attacks, deaths from violence, riots, strikes, political executions.
The usual signs of trouble.
Right. Protest demonstrations, assassinations, and economic indicators, too.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. You'd think the economy would be huge.
They looked at changes in exports, imports, income per capita, consumer prices. Later, they added even more. Social conflicts like ethnic or religious tension, capital flight, tax hikes, food shortages, inflation.
They were really trying to cover all the bases.
Oh, yeah. Opposition activities, how organized they were, any conspiracies, terrorism. Military attitudes were key too, threats to their interests, discontent over pay or careers. Plus, just straight-up reports or rumors of coup plots. External factors, regime capabilities.
Okay, so here's the million-dollar question then. After tracking all that data, what did the CIA conclude? Did bad economic conditions directly lead to coups in their view?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Their conclusion was that the correlation was actually low.
Really? Low?
Yeah, low. If there was underlying political stability or if the government wasn't making specific economic moves that really angered key groups, it tells you a lot about how they saw it. Political factors often seem to outweigh the purely economic ones in triggering a coup.
Okay, so let's pivot to the U.S. perspective. We know they intervened elsewhere. Why? What was the justification for getting involved in another country's internal politics, sometimes drastically?
Well, during the Cold War, the stakes felt incredibly high. U.S. administrations saw themselves as a superpower, obviously, and felt they could intervene if their core national interests were threatened. Sometimes even if just major U.S. businesses were at risk.
And how did those decisions get made? Was it just the president saying go?
It was more complex. Thinkers like Graham Allison and Philip Zelikow gave us models like the organizational behavior model or bureaucratic politics. It suggests that different parts of the government, State Department, CIA, Pentagon sort of compete. They have their own routines, their own priorities, and the final policy can be a messy compromise between them.
So not always one single unified plan. And what tools did they have in their toolkit for intervention?
A whole range. It could be diplomatic pressure or maybe funding opposition groups, spreading covert propaganda.
The softer stuff.
Right. But it could also escalate to outright coups, assassinations, even paramilitary operations. And the CIA, set up by the National Security Act of 1947, was the main agency for these covert actions. The key thing was deniability. The U.S. role should not be apparent or acknowledged publicly.
That sounds risky.
Hugely risky. Mark Lowenthal, an intelligence expert, argued covert action should be a last resort. High costs, politically and financially. Big risk of exposure, failure. Serious ethical questions, too.
Right.
And, crucially, they needed what's called a presidential finding, a formal green light from the president.
Okay. And we know they did use these tools elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely. The list is long. Brazil 64, Cambodia 70, Congo 60, Cuba 61, that was the Bay of Pigs, Chile 73, Dominican Republic 61, Iran 53, Guatemala 54, South Vietnam 63.
Wow.
Yeah. And a 1986 CIA report even mentioned the agency supporting plotters in 24 coup attempts and suppressing 17 others. But here's the kicker for our discussion. That report says nothing about Turkey.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the U.S. side. What about the Turkish military itself? What was driving them to step into politics? You mentioned they had a unique self-image.
They really did. They saw themselves as having this dual role, not just defending borders, but also guaranteeing the democratic republic, ensuring the continuity of the Turkish state tradition, almost like guardians.
Guardian. So they felt they had the right, maybe even the duty, to intervene.
That's how they perceived it, often without feeling they needed permission from anyone else. William Hale traces this back to what he calls 3 disharmonious legacies: the power of the old Ottoman Empire, the 19th century reforms, and founding the Republic after World War I, all things the army was central to.
So it's deep-seated,
It's
historical.
Very. And they even had a kind of legal justification, Article 35 of their internal law, an update to the 1961 Constitution, basically authorized intervention if the Republic faced a domestic threat. They had this double autonomy, separate from society and politicians. Even Ataturk, the founder, seemed to back this guardian role early on.
So you have this powerful institution with a strong sense of its own mission. How did that play out before the first coup?
Well, there was friction. Military leaders pushed back against civilian control attempts starting around 1949. When one party tried to put the chief of general staff under the defense minister, the military saw it as a degradation.
Ouch.
Then, under Prime Minister Menderes and the Democrat Party, military budgets were cut and policies favored rural areas. This caused disquiet, especially among junior officers who really felt those economic changes. It kind of set the stage.
So you've got internal military unhappiness plus this historical guardian mentality.
Yeah.
A pretty volatile mix.
Exactly. And remember, Turkey had 2 successful coups in this period, 1960 and 1980, and that 1971 coup by memorandum. They worked. There wasn't significant resistance, which probably just reinforced the military's view of its role.
This context is where those allegations of CIA involvement come in, right? From both sides of the political spectrum in Turkey.
Yes. Right-wing figures might point to Menderes maybe getting too close to the Soviets, or later issues like the Poppy crisis or the U.S. arms embargo in '75. Left-wing voices argued the military was used to suppress anti-American sentiment.
Lots of theories, lots of accusations.
But the paper we're focusing on tries to cut through that by sticking purely to the declassified documents. Not memoirs, not unsourced claims, but the CIA's own internal records.
Okay, let's get into the first big one then. The May 27, 1960 coup. The military takes over, but they immediately say they're loyal to NATO and CENTO. What do the archives tell us? Did the U.S. see this coming? Were they involved?
The documents paint a picture of, surprise, actually. There are signs of military unhappiness, sure, and political chaos, but the CIA seems to have paid little attention to the lower levels of the military.
The plotting was happening.
Apparently, early CIA reports just don't really mention a coup possibility. Get this. A report from May 5th, 1960, just 3 weeks before the coup, did not anticipate any kind of military intervention, even though it mentioned student protests.
That's pretty unaware.
Right. And the CIA later figured the junior officers started planning back in February. So if they'd been involved, you'd think that May 5th report would have reflected it. Alan Dulles, the DCI, only mentioned a possibility 3 days before the coup, when huge demonstrations made it sort of obvious something might happen. Not enough time to really support or oppose it.
Okay, so they seemed caught off guard beforehand. What about right after it happened? What was the reaction then?
The reports immediately after May 27th 30th, 31st. They all consistently say the CIA was neither involved in nor had prior information about the coup. They were scrambling for info. They didn't even know the coup's political leaning until General Gersel told the U.S. Embassy it was just against Menderes and Turkey would stick with the U.S. and NATO.
So they were playing catch-up.
Completely. They had to put great effort into investigating the members of the NUC National Unity Committee who were trained in the U.S. after the coup. If they'd been involved, they'd know who these guys were.
Good point.
And they were writing memos about the possible deterioration of U.S. interests under the new regime. Why would you do that if you'd installed it? A July 1960 report even found the new military government's approaches to U.S. officials surprising. Plus, there are no documents recommending support for another coup or aid to the NUC, and key figures from that coup, like Turkish or Madanolu, got zero CIA backing in the 1965 elections.
So summing up 1960 based on these archives.
The evidence really points away from direct U.S. involvement in planning or executing it. The U.S. seems to have been maybe comfortable, perhaps complacent about Turkey before the coup, but afterwards. They definitely started paying much closer attention to the Turkish military, especially those junior officers. It was a wake-up call.
Okay, let's jump forward to 1971, the coup by memorandum. The military issues a warning, the prime minister resigns, but the military doesn't take over directly. What were U.S.-Turkish relations like leading up to this?
Not great, actually. 1969, 1970. It was not a good time, as the paper puts it. Turkey was trying to carve out a more independent foreign policy. Prime Minister Demirel was pushing back hard against U.S. pressure to ban opium poppy cultivation, the famous poppy crisis.
Right.
And there was a serious anti-American wave protests, some violence against U.S. interests, even U.S. sailors. So tensions were definitely high. The U.S. certainly had concerns.
Given that friction, you could see why some might suspect U.S. involvement. What did the CIA know about the military's mood?
Well, they knew something was up. A secret letter from the Air Force commander, Mushin Batur, outlining military discontent had leaked. The U.S. Embassy reported on it. So the CIA must have been aware of the rumblings.
But were they comfortable with another coup, especially after being surprised in 1960?
That's the interesting part. An October 69 report mentions scattered rumors among junior and mid-level officers, but calls their influence one of the imponderables. Earlier reports from 64 and 66 suggested any successful coup needed top commanders involved. They even warned the military might step in if the political opposition caused a crisis.
So it sounds like they preferred stability, or at least intervention by the senior brass, not the unpredictable junior officers again.
Exactly. The CIA was not comfortable with a possible military coup staged by junior officers, like the one in 1960. They'd seen the top generals actually suppress junior officer movements before, like in 1960 so they're watching, but maybe hoping the seniors kept control.
Yeah, there's a specific claim that gets cited a lot from something called the CIA base of Ralph McGehee. It basically says the 1971 coup was carried out by the CIA, Turkish counter-guerrillas, and the military. Sounds pretty direct.
It does, but that's a really important point to clarify. The paper states that a careful investigation reveals that the note is the personal view of the German journalist Jürgen Roth, rather than an intelligence document.
Ah, so it's a journalist's opinion, not a CIA leak.
Correct. And apparently there are distortions or errors in Roth's account. Critically, neither McGeehee's own writings nor the actual declassified CIA files mention anything like that for Turkey in 1971. It seems to be a persistent misattribution.
Okay, so setting that claim aside, what do the actual CIA estimates from before the 1971 memorandum say?
About 2 months before, a national estimate looked at 2 coup scenarios: junior officers or top commanders. It admitted that plotting by top commanders must be tightly held. There was no assurance that the U.S. would hear about it before an attempt was made.
So acknowledging they might be in the dark again.
Right. And it speculated that U.S. reaction would probably not be a factor of great moment for the plotters, pointing out that the U.S. had restored aid to Greece even after its military coup.
And after the memorandum was issued.
The report for the National Security Council on March 22, 1971 says neither CIA nor any other department had early contact with the group that issued the memorandum. It then focuses on how to push the new government under Nihat Erim on the poppy ban. That suggests they were reacting to events, not directing them.
So the conclusion for 1971. Still no smoking gun in the archives.
Despite the U.S. having clear concerns anti-Americanism, the poppy issued the documents offer no clues about support for the Turkish military or clandestine operation. It's difficult to find any evidence of direct U.S. involvement in planning and executing that memorandum coup, even though the U.S. definitely tried to improve relations afterwards.
Okay, on to the last big one. The September 12, 1980 coup. This time, the Chief of General Staff, Kenan Evren, leads it. And this one has that infamous quote attached, "Our boys have done it." What's the real story there?
Yeah, that quote is everywhere. It's attributed to Paul Hentz, former CIA station chief in Turkey, then on Carter's National Security Council. But the paper clarifies it was likely a misunderstanding by a journalist, Mehmet Ali Barand.
A misunderstanding. How so?
Hens apparently said something like, the boys in Ankara did it, simply meaning he'd received news from Ankara that the coup had happened. He later insisted Washington neither told the Turkish military what to do or what not to do, and preferred to remain distant and silent. So not a claim of responsibility, just news relay.
Right, context matters. What were U.S. interests like just before this 1980 coup?
Things have been rocky. Remember the 1975 arms embargo after Turkey's Cyprus operation? The Turkish government under Demirel retaliated by suspending U.S. military bases. That really undermined U.S. interests. A 1976 CIA report even worried Turkey might no longer be a politically reliable member of NATO.
So the U.S. definitely had reasons to want to change, or at least more stability. Did they know this coup was coming?
They had warnings. The U.S. Embassy in Ankara told Washington on June 5, 1980, about the imminent possibility of military takeover. Hens himself thought the military started planning way back in December 1978.
And what was the CIA's assessment of a potential coup around that time?
Two reports from 1979 highlight the possibility of a military intervention, maybe like the 1971 memorandum. One report from February 79 noted that, given the military's orientation, a coup would probably not lead to revolutionary changes in Turkish society or foreign policy.
Basically, things wouldn't change too drastically from a U.S. perspective.
That seems to have been the thinking. It even suggested some alteration between democracy and military involvement seemed possible in Turkey. The CIA appeared to believe the military would be more amenable to U.S. interests than the civilian government.
Why?
Partly because the military was hit hard by that arms embargo. They desperately needed U.S. aid for modernization. So from the agency's viewpoint, maybe a coup might be a good thing for U.S. strategic interests.
Okay, so they saw it coming, maybe even thought it could be beneficial. But does that mean they helped make it happen?
That's the crucial distinction. The evidence points more towards anticipation and maybe quiet approval rather than orchestration. Minutes from a top-secret CIA meeting on September 12, 1980, the actual day of the coup show, analysts generally seeing it as a reluctant move by General Evren, indeed a last resort. And an October 1980 memo even flags the agency's failure to anticipate the coup, meaning its exact timing and details as a problem. That doesn't sound like an agency that ran the show.
So no evidence of planning or execution? What about after the coup?
Well, after the takeover, the U.S. did support the military regime. There are memos about processing requests for U.S. financial aid from the generals, like one in May 81, and another in September 81 proposed pressuring other Western countries to mute political criticism of the Evren regime as long as it seemed to be moving back toward democracy.
So support after the fact, but not before or during.
That's what the documents suggest. And it's significant that while we have declassified presidential findings authorizing covert actions in places like Honduras and Nicaragua around that time, there's simply no evidence of presidential findings for Turkey.
So the final word on 1980, based on these archives?
The available research simply has not found any tangible evidence to support those claims of direct U.S. involvement in the planning, organizing, or carrying out of the 1980 coup.
Okay, so across all three major Cold War interventions, 1960, 1971, 1980, the declassified CIA documents investigated here don't show direct U.S. involvement in planning or execution. If the CIA was involved in coups elsewhere, why does Turkey seem to be different based on this evidence?
The paper suggests Turkey is an exception for a couple of key reasons. First, Turkey's strategic position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union meant it really had no alternative to good relations with the U.S. and NATO. Most of its vital military and financial aid came from there.
So the U.S. didn't need to intervene directly. Whoever was in power in Ankara would eventually need U.S. support anyway.
That seems to be the argument. It was far less necessary for the U.S. to develop close relations with any kind of government in Turkey than it would have to organize a coup for the sake of national interests.
Makes sense. And the second reason?
NATO. Intervening directly in the domestic politics of a major NATO ally like Turkey would have been incredibly risky for the U.S. within the alliance. It would have raised concerns about the role of the U.S. in the Western alliance, potentially damaging relationships with other European allies.
Right. Interfering in the Eastern Bloc is one thing, but Messing with a key ally is another.
Exactly. The fight against communism could justify actions elsewhere, but not easily within NATO itself.
But what about all those persistent arguments within Turkey that the CIA was involved? And the idea that maybe the incriminating documents just haven't been declassified yet?
Yeah, the paper addresses that. It notes many Turkish political parties used these popular arguments about CIA involvement, perhaps to appeal to voters with anti-American feelings, but none have produced concrete evidence.
And the still classified argument.
The author finds it implausible. Given that sensitive archives about U.S. actions in other countries have been opened, why would Turkey be totally different? Plus, there's the accountability principle. In the U.S. system, Congress can demand answers under oath, like they did regarding the 1967 Greek coup. It seems unlikely Turkey, a crucial NATO ally, could completely escape that kind of scrutiny if there was direct involvement.
So maybe it wasn't direct involvement, but calculated indifference or strategic patience.
That seems closer to what the evidence suggests. It's possible the U.S. welcomed the military interventions in 1971 and 1980 because the preceding civilian governments had ignored U.S. interests. And they knew from 1960 that the military regimes tended to be eager to build close ties. So maybe the U.S. strategy was just to remain aloof from Turkish domestic conflicts, knowing its strategic interests would likely be secured eventually, regardless of who was in power, simply because of Turkey's geopolitical reality.
Okay, so let's bring this all together. Based on this deep dive into Burak Kürkçü's analysis of the currently available declassified CIA documents, what's the main takeaway about U.S. involvement in Turkey's Cold War coups?
The core finding is pretty clear. A careful look at the currently available declassified CIA records has found no tangible evidence of the direct involvement of the U.S. in coup planning in Turkey during the Cold War. Now, that doesn't deny indirect roles like military aid or political recognition after the coups happened, but direct planning or execution, the evidence isn't there in these files.
Which leaves us with a bit of a cliffhanger, doesn't it? A provocative thought for the future.
It does. The author specifically notes that questions about direct U.S. involvement in post-Cold War events in Turkey, like the 1997 postmodern coup or the failed 2016 coup attempt, that is still under question as long as the related archival documents of the CIA have not been released to researchers.
So the story might not be fully told yet. As you, our listener, think about this. Consider how much our understanding of history depends on access to information, on which records see the light of day. And maybe consider how sometimes the absence of evidence in the files we do have can be just as significant as finding that smoking gun. It's a reminder that history is an ongoing investigation,